Okay, next we're going to take a look at Plato's Euthyphro, which is one of his most well-known dialogues. It's one of his shortest dialogues, which makes it really accessible for students in the philosophy classroom. And it's a dialogue that takes to task an issue that I think you probably have thought about before. It's something that's really a pertinent sort of problem. And that is, namely, what do we know about good and evil? What do we know about right and wrong? What do we know about piety or righteousness, to use these more technical, fancier terms that you'll see on this slide here? And do we really know what we think we know? This is a classic Socratic theme. I'm sure you've heard before that the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates was famous for trying to get people to realize that they didn't actually know what they thought they knew. You see this very much at work in this text. This text, though, is written by Plato, of course, not by Socrates. Plato was, however, a real-life student of Socrates. So what's a little bit confusing about this is that in this dialogue, Euthyphro, you have a couple of characters, one of whom is named Socrates. And we find Plato do this in a lot of his writings. He liked to use Socrates as a character. And you want to be careful to not necessarily assume that something Socrates, the character in a dialogue, says is something that the real Socrates believed. We really are pretty unsure about what the real Socrates believed because we don't have any of his writings. So another thing I want to say here in the early going before we get to the content of the text itself is that Plato wrote this dialogue early on. This is a text that dates from his early career. If we take a look back here on this early slide, you'll see that I've written that we think this dialogue was produced somewhere between 399 and 390 years before the Common Era. So what does it mean? What is the significance of this being an early dialogue? Well, first of all, you don't necessarily have the mature system of so-called Platonism, ISM, that you find in some of his later dialogues, and you'll even find in the dialogue Meno, which we're going to read next. So this would also apply to some of his really famous texts, including the text maybe that if you've read any Plato, you perhaps have read this text, The Republic, in which Plato goes on and on about his ideal form of government, but also many sorts of other philosophical themes that don't necessarily just fit into the idea of a political state. So let's go ahead and get started here with Euthyphro, the dialogue itself. We have these two characters who come up against one another in a court. Not a royal court, a court of law. And one of them is named Socrates, as I said, just based on the real-life Socrates, but not necessarily something that the real Socrates actually did or said. And then this other guy named Euthyphro, of course, the namesake of the dialogue. Socrates is at court because he's been accused of doing something wrong. He's been accused of a crime. And the crime is that he's been accused of corrupting young people, specifically by denying the existence of the Greek gods, the same Greek gods that you probably have heard stories about before, Zeus, Athena, and so on. And not only did he deny these Greek gods, but he was accused of making up his own gods. So this was considered a very serious charge, and this is why we find Socrates at court. This is a little bit different, though, from why Euthyphro is at court. He's not at court because he's been accused of something, but rather he's accusing somebody else of something. And what's really interesting, what really strikes and intrigues Socrates here, is that Euthyphro is actually accusing his father. And he's accusing his father of murder. Murdering a slave in particular. And we're given in these early pages the reason for this murder. Apparently, allegedly, this slave that Euthyphro's father killed was guilty of killing another one of his slaves. So we also hear that this murder that Euthyphro's father carried out against this slave who killed one of the other slaves wasn't really a direct murder. This wasn't an example of him grabbing this slave by the neck or committing some sort of act of violence against him resulting in his death. Rather, he kind of let this slave die. He left him in a pit, didn't give him food or water, and the slave eventually died from lack of nourishment. Socrates is absolutely shocked. He cannot believe that Euthyphro is at court, ready to accuse his father of murder. And Plato really deliberately makes it a really curious case too, right? I mean, we want to pay attention to the fact that it's his own father that he's accusing. We want to pay attention to the fact that not only is it his own father, but his father killed a slave, right? These days we of course know slavery is wrong, but in these times it was far too common, unfortunately. Not only was this a slave that his father indirectly, passively killed, let die, but this slave also killed another slave. So Plato very deliberately wrote this in a way to make it seem like a sort of weak charge that Euthyphro is bringing against his father. We don't want to pass over that. So Socrates is really, really shocked that Euthyphro is here at court for this reason. And he finds that Euthyphro claims to know what piety is. Euthyphro is really confident about what he's doing. He thinks he's doing something right. He thinks he's doing something moral. And this is because he claims to have knowledge, as I said, of piety, or what we could call righteousness. And Euthyphro here in the first few pages of the dialogue also says that his knowledge of right and wrong, of what's good and what's evil, doesn't make any difference whether we're talking about someone who's a stranger or a relative. So this is why he doesn't get that Socrates is so shocked that he's there to accuse his own father. For Euthyphro, that's irrelevant. It doesn't matter that it's my own father if I'm doing what is right. It makes no difference. So Socrates is floored, but he approaches the issue in a very humble way. He says, Euthyphro, is it possible that you can teach me? You have this knowledge of what piety is. I don't know what it is. Can you show me? And Euthyphro agrees. Euthyphro says, sure, I will teach you what I know, Socrates. And we start with this first definition that he gives Socrates for piety. He says, piety is what I'm doing now. That is, persecuting the wrongdoer, just as we find Zeus doing in these famous stories about the Greek gods. And that's at 5e or 6b out in the margins. So Socrates is kind of floored. He's a bit incredulous. He says, you believe all of that? Those things and those stories? You can already kind of see why Socrates got in trouble for denying the Greek gods. And you can understand maybe to a certain extent why he was brought to court. But there's another problem here. It's not just that Euthyphro is making an appeal to Greek mythology to justify what he's doing. We have another issue in that this first definition that Euthyphro tries to give isn't really a definition at all. He says, piety is what I'm doing right now. Socrates dismisses this really quickly because what he wants is not an example, right? But rather something that fits all examples. He wants, in other words, a definition. He wants to know, you could say, what the essence is, or to use another term that is very common in Platonic philosophy, he wants to know about the form of piety, the form of the pious. So the problem here is Euthyphro says that piety is what I'm doing now, and that's great. Maybe that's correct. Maybe it's an example. But there are many other pious actions, of course. There are many other things that we think are good things to do. What is it that groups all of these things together? What is it in virtue of which, or I should say, for what reason is it that we group these things together in a way that to most of us makes sense, in a way that to most of us is reasonable? So as you see here on this next slide, Socrates wants to know the form, the universal definition, the essence of the pious. So Euthyphro takes another shot at answering this. He tries to give Socrates what he's looking for. He says, what is dear to the gods is pious, and what is not dear to the gods is what is impious. So impious, of course, just being the negation of pious. We could sub in any number of replacement terms there. Wickedness, immoral, both of these would work. Socrates is also going to have an issue with this definition, though. He's going to point out to Euthyphro, isn't it the case, if we look at these stories about the Greek gods, that they're always in a state of discord, that they're always fighting and warring with one another? You'll find that at 7b, out in the margins. Euthyphro agrees. He says, yeah, that's the case. And Socrates asks him, why do you think it is that these people are in a state of discord, these gods? Why is it that they're warring with one another? Don't you think that it's likely the case that they're fighting for the same reason that humans are fighting? Namely, they disagree over what's just and unjust, they disagree over what is beautiful and what is ugly, and they disagree over what's good and what's bad. And Euthyphro agrees. He says, yeah, that does seem to be the case. So Socrates says, well, then this isn't the form or the universal definition or the essence of piety at all. And look at one specific example, Euthyphro. The gods very explicitly in these stories, in these myths, disagree on whether it's okay to kill one's father. Patricide, as you see it there on the slide. And the example given at 8b is patricide is something that was pleasing to Zeus, but displeasing to Cronus. Cronus, of course, being the father of Zeus, who Zeus killed. And Euthyphro kind of doesn't really understand. He gets the example, he gets what Socrates is telling him, but he doesn't understand what Socrates is really looking for when he's asking for a definition. So we want to pay attention here. For Socrates, the point is that the gods disagree on what constitutes wrongdoing, right? Euthyphro seems to think that the issue is that they all still agree that it's okay to punish someone for doing wrong, and that is the definition of piety. No, that's not the definition of piety at all. And Socrates tries to get him to realize this. He tries to get him to realize that that's irrelevant, really, right? It's not really the case that we're worried about the gods disagreeing or agreeing on wrongs being worthy of punishment. That's quite well and good, but that doesn't really help us here. The issue is, what is it that counts as wrong? What is it that counts as good in the very first place? So Socrates is going to help Euthyphro a little bit here. He's going to give Euthyphro an alternative. He's going to say, what if we modify a little bit your definition and we say that piety is what is loved by all of the gods, and impiety is what is hated by all of the gods, and we just exclude everything else? Would that be a better definition? You'll find that at 9c. So let's take a look and see if this is going to work, adding in this quantifier, all, in front of the definition that Euthyphro already gave. Let's look at some examples of things that I think most of us would all agree are good. So maybe doing things like feeding someone who's hungry, clothing someone who's sick, helping out the poor, or maybe punishing people who harm others, right? Even that, which we dismissed a moment ago as not the definition of piety, but it's still useful for us to think through here. Most of us, I think, would agree that these are good or pious things to do. How is it that we all agree that these things are pious? Why do we agree? In virtue of what do we call any two actions pious? What is it that groups them together? This is where the famous Euthyphro dilemma comes in. This is the most famous part of this dialogue. This is also the most important part of this dialogue. And the dilemma goes like this. It says, is the pious what it is because the gods love it, or is the pious loved because of what it is? Let me put that in another way, in more contemporary language. Let's say you give somebody a gift and they like it. Do they like that gift because it's a good gift? Or is the gift a good one because that person likes it? That kind of follows the same logic here. So let's take another look back at the definition we're working with here, this alternative revised definition that Socrates gives to Euthyphro. He says, maybe piety is what is loved by all of the gods, and impiety is what is hated by all of the gods. Socrates will bring up the dilemma as a response to this definition. Socrates is first going to try to show that it must be the case that the former is the right approach here, right? That piety is what it is because the gods love it. But he very quickly then will show that can't be the case. That can't be right. It doesn't make any sense. Why? Well, if the piety is what it is just because the gods love it, then we're just talking about a quality of something rather than the thing itself, right? So you might think of this as the difference between something being godly and something being God-loved, right? Something being a truly good thing and something that is just perceived to be good. There's of course a distinction there, and it's pretty obvious. So what's going to be the problem here? The second alternative isn't going to make sense either. If we go with the first, right, then morality is grounded just on the taste, the arbitrary taste, I should say, of the gods. And some of them are into pretty immoral stuff, and maybe some of them even agree that immoral things are good. So this isn't going to seem right. It can't be the case that goodness and rightness are just grounded on some sort of arbitrary predilection. So we want to look at the other side of the dilemma, the other alternative here, and we find that it doesn't work either. Why? Well, this one's a little more subtle. If we go with the latter part of the dilemma here, what we find is that morality actually isn't up to the gods, which raises a lot of questions about why we do what we do. It also raises the question of what a god is in the first place, right? If morality isn't up to the gods, if the gods love it because of what it is, if the piety is something they love because of intrinsic qualities that it has, right? Because of its very nature, well then, isn't this thing, piety, higher than the gods themselves? Don't the gods kind of answer to this thing? Wouldn't this thing at the top of the pyramid be the real god? And it wouldn't even make sense to talk about other gods underneath this thing. So Euthyphro is going to try to work this out. He's going to say that the gods love piety because of what it is, but at the very same time, he's going to insist that it's also the case that something that is loved is so because it is being loved, not just because it is a loved thing. So what you have here is what we would call in philosophy the distinction between internal and external justification. Euthyphro is trying to rely on both. He's trying to say that piety is both internally justified, right? It is what it is for its own reasons. It doesn't require any perception or any attitude from gods or from humans, while at the same time, he can only justify that by turning to external justification. He can only say that we know that's the case based on the way the gods perceive this thing, right? So this is circular reasoning. This isn't going to work. At the very same time, he's suggesting that we can tell what's pious by looking at what all of the gods love, while he also seems to be saying that piety internally justifies itself. So as I said, this is really clearly an example of circular reasoning. And it isn't just a problem for polytheistic systems of religion. This is also a problem in monotheism. And you'll find that many Christian philosophers and theologians for hundreds of years, thousands of years really, have tried to figure out how to get out of the Euthyphro dilemma. No one's really succeeded satisfactorily. How do these Christian commentators put the Euthyphro dilemma in monotheistic terms? Well, they say, on the one hand, it's either the case that wrong is wrong because God says so, and for no other reason, right? Wrong is wrong because God says so, and for no other reason, or God says that something is wrong because it is wrong. Right? In other words, you'll see if you research this at all on the internet, this is something like the distinction between God being an expert on morality, which would be wrong is wrong because God says so, or the alternative, which is God says an act is wrong because it is wrong, where God is something like the engineer, right? God is somebody who just makes wrong what it is. Well, really, I've flipped these. We would want to say that he's engineering morality in the first case, right, where wrong is wrong because God says so and for no other reason. So he's just making it up, really. We would say that's the engineer side. And then the other one here, the bottom one, God says an act is wrong because it is wrong. That's where God would be the expert on morality, the expert on right versus wrong. But again, as I said when we explained this in polytheistic terms a couple of minutes ago, at that point it doesn't really make sense to have a God, right? If right and wrong are at the top of this pyramid and God is lower than that, right? God says an act is wrong because it is wrong, well, then we kind of have to get rid of God. Let me elaborate on this a little bit. The problem is that wrong either isn't actually wrong for any other reason other than God says so therefore isn't really wrong at all, and is only arbitrary, because God, as engineer of morality, could have said anything is wrong, and we would have had to just go along with it. Or, on the other hand, right and wrong are higher than God, and God himself answers to something higher, meaning that God doesn't seem like much of a God at all. So people often don't like this, and I'm very familiar with people in BPQ wanting to push back against this dilemma, right? And it's understandable why people would do this, because a lot of us who think that we are moral, who think we're pious, who think we're good people, we take issue. We don't like being told that we're either, on the one hand, following just arbitrary orders from God, right? And God could have tricked us into thinking that good things are actually wrong and wrong things are actually good. At the very same time that we don't like following something that's either just entirely made up or at the very least, not given by gods, right? Something that is higher than God, something that doesn't rely upon God at all. Now, a lot of people are going to want to say that their God isn't giving arbitrary orders. Rather, they want to say God calls the pious pious because it really is that thing. Now, here's the problem, right? That invokes precisely the circular reasoning that the dilemma is trying to expose. God calls the pious pious because it really is the pious, right? We can only really justify that by looking at the other side of the dilemma, which makes it circular, which means that we're trying to rely both on that external and internal justification. So, to put it yet just one more way, is pious what it is? Is piety what it is because of how the gods treat it? Or do they treat it like they do because of what it is? We can't really figure out how to proceed here. And in the text, they never really figure it out. They never really are able to get beyond the dilemma. They do, however, cover some other things, not quite as important, that they say piety is not. So these are negative definitions. Things that piety is not. First of all, we have this view that piety can't be the same thing. It can't just be a synonym with justice. Maybe it's a part of justice, right? Maybe it's an example of doing something that's just, but it's not coextensive. It's not the same thing. They also say that piety can't be care for the gods. Piety can't be care for the gods because if it's caring for the gods, then it's giving the gods something they lack. It's giving them something they need. But if they need something from humans, from mortals, if they're lacking anything at all, how on earth could we say that they're gods? They don't seem like very much of gods if that's the case. Similarly, we wouldn't want to say that piety can be service or trade with the gods. Because, well, it would only make sense for them to want to trade with us or be served by us, again, if they lacked or needed something. We already showed what the problem was with that. But there's another way to put that, right? We can't say that piety is just whatever is pleasing to the gods, because let us remind ourselves, they don't even agree on what's pleasing. And even in situations, even in cases where they do agree on what's pleasing, that doesn't tell us at all what the thing itself is, the essence of piety, the form in question, the universal definition that we're looking for. Lastly, Euthyphro and Socrates decide that piety cannot be a quality of something, because the thing only has that quality because it is being loved by the gods, not because of what it is. In other words, not because it is internally justified. So how does this dialogue end? Well, it ends in basically complete absence of any sort of conclusion or definitive answer. We call this in ancient Greek philosophy aporia, which is just a confusing sort of culmination of the dialogue where it doesn't really seem that anything has been solved. And in this particular dialogue, Euthyphro, we find that Socrates actually suggests that Euthyphro has argued in a circle and that they need to start back at the beginning. And they say, well, if we had time, we could maybe do this, but now I have to go, Euthyphro says. So they really aren't able to solve this for the reader in the dialogue itself, meaning it's something for you to think about. Now, I want to close, actually, with a brief reference to so-called pop culture, which is a Jay-Z Kanye song from one of their albums a couple of years ago. No Church in the Wild is the song in question. And this song actually has a lyric that's pretty much a paraphrased line straight out of the Euthyphro dialogue of Plato. The line is, and it's Jay-Z who actually raps this line, is pious pious because God loves pious? Socrates asked, whose bias do y'all seek? That's exactly what we're getting at here, right? The idea being any definition of piety that makes reference to gods is going to be one that's biased. It's going to be one that's relative. It's going to be one that's human, right? It's probably going to be wrong. And the problem is it's a human idea that often masquerades as something else. So we want to be very careful, the Euthyphro dilemma tells us, as well as this song, No Church in the Wild, with anything we believe concerning what is pious, concerning what's good, especially when it comes to religious morality. So this dialogue isn't really just a critique of Greek mythology, of all of the Greek gods. A lot of the time students think that this was only an issue for some sort of polytheistic system, and that if you're a Christian or a Muslim, that you don't need to be worried about this because you have only one God. Not quite the case. You really want to be concerned about this no matter what God you're talking about, right? Because any doctrinal religious system, whether it's Christianity, whether it's Islam, Judaism, whatever you want to pick, right, is going to presuppose that God's will has something to do with what's good. And the longer you think about that, the deeper you think about it, the dilemma comes up. And it gets really hard to solve. A lot of Christian writers in particular have tried to solve the Euthyphro dilemma, and they've pretty much failed. They've offered theological solutions to it, but no one to this date has really been able to overcome it using reason, overcome it using philosophy, overcome it using logic, right? So that's the problem. That the only way to solve it is using these sorts of tools, not just quoting the Bible or quoting the Quran or something, right? These wouldn't work. Now, I want to remind you, I told you in the beginning here that this dialogue is one that's early from Plato's career, and it really captures more of what we think the real-life Socrates believed. Eventually, you probably know this if you've read Republic, Plato completely abandons the idea of relativity, the idea of subjectivity, the idea that we can't know anything because everything is just particular, and the idea is even that maybe goodness and right and wrong and piety are just made up things in our heads. Plato's definitely going to mature out of that. And in the next dialogue that we read, which is one that exemplifies so-called Platonism, we'll see Plato go ahead and start doing this. We'll see Plato say that it's possible to have universal knowledge of some things. It's possible to know the universal essence of some things, mathematical types of knowledge, as well as higher forms like what is good, what is beauty, what is justice. So Plato is going to kind of have an answer for you, but it's still not really going to be enough to solve the Euthyphro dilemma. What's going to be really tricky in Meno, this next dialogue we read, is that to buy what Plato says about non-relativistic types of knowledge, we're going to have to be committed to certain beliefs that I think some of us aren't going to like. For example, the eternal soul, which, unlike some religions, doesn't just say that after you die your soul goes on, but goes even further and says your soul always existed even before you were born, and you're actually reborn over and over. Some religions do believe that, of course, but you don't believe that in Christianity, or to the best of my knowledge in Islam. You don't believe that your soul existed since the beginning of time. Plato's also going to require us to be committed to the idea that you don't ever actually learn anything. You're never actually taught anything. Instead, you just remember things that your eternal soul always knew. And I know that sounds really crazy, but you'll see once we start Meno next in this class that he's actually got a pretty good argument for it, especially when it comes to how we know that math is right, how we know that math is true.